is Steven Gerardo from Greenland, and yes, I am on the phone. Thank you. I'm pushing the numbers the way I'm supposed to, and it's not clicking into the meeting. You're not letting me in or something.
Thank God.
Okay, do you want any help with that? So you clicked the link and then when it popped up, you tried opening it and it didn't work?
Right. It turned color. It turned to color, but it's not letting me in for some reason.
David, let him in.
You know, I'm not showing him as being connected, so let me double check things here.
Not a bad guy.
I recommended you for the chair position. You
Yeah,
forgot.
I know. I'm stuck now.
Now you hate me for it.
Well, almost.
All right, I'm going to send out another link. I know there's at least one other person that's having trouble connecting.
Oh, wait a minute. Something's happened here. The site is trying to open Zoom meeting. It's trying to open. All
right, if that doesn't work, Stephen, I've got another link coming to you.
Wait a sec. Maybe I'm going in. I've been to so many of these meetings, so I know how to do it.
Right.
Okay, I'm coming.
Yeah. All right. Yep, we're seeing you in the waiting room.
I'm gonna hang up the phone and I'll be on. You're gonna put me on video. I mean audio.
Yep.
Okay,
You're in.
Hang up.
All right, I know there's one other person who is having trouble connecting and I just resent them the link. So assuming that actually works for them, when they come in, maybe we can get started. Dave Sharples from Exeter. So
I can hear you, thank you.
Excellent, Stephen.
You want to do the introductions, David? And the quick orientation.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody is pretty much used to Zoom by now.
Except
me. What?
No, except Greenland.
Greenland, yeah. Stephen's figuring it out. So we're gonna go. Let's see. I'm all out of sorts here now.
Richard, you know how many Zoom meetings I've been to this week?
12.
No, just 2, but this is the 3rd one, so I know what I'm doing.
He's whining.
I know what I'm doing. I'm getting up too early to be here.
Yeah, the crack of noon.
Yeah, crack of noon. All right, so we have a relatively small group here today, but if you be going through presentations and stuff, if you have questions, I'm going to. I know my presentation's a little bit long, so yeah, I know. I sort of purposely built in breaks every little bit to just make sure that everybody's on the same page. So there's a lot of, there'll be an opportunity within mine to sort of look back and ask questions or make comments about what I've said over the previous few slides, and just kind of built that in because it's a little bit of a complicated process that we need to get through. Otherwise, if you have any comments or a question, raise your hand. Use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you're on the phone only, certainly, if you need to interrupt, go ahead, and we'll sort through it. We have just a few items on the agenda, so we should be able to get through it in the time allotted to the TAC. Although, crazier things have happened than a meeting.
Can I interrupt just for 1 minute?
No.
I want to leave this meeting today with knowing how to get the application, not all the other reams of the bull, the application to Greenland so they can submit it for once and for all to Matt Scruton and Charlotte Huzzy. Now, are you going to send them a link, or how you want to do that?
They should already have a link.
You sent it already?
Yep.
Okay. So I got to follow through with that.
Yep. So, okay, so we do have to do any approvals have to be by a roll call vote, unfortunately, which tends to slow things down a little bit. So that will happen. I should have put on the agenda this project solicitation and selection criteria process. That one will have to. I need a motion on that as well. So we're going to need have to go through a roll call vote on that in the end, at least to make a recommendation to the policy committee for their meeting in about 2 weeks. So with that, I think we can probably get started on the agenda.
Want to approve the minutes?
Well, we probably need to go through the roll call of folks that are here.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll go through that, and I'm not going to require anybody to say if they're alone in the room or whatever that statement is. Just maybe just who you are and what town you're representing or what agency you're representing. I myself, Dave Walker, Assistant Director at RPC. Amy, you are next on my list.
Amy Warheft, Office Coordinator here at RPC.
Scott, you are next.
Scott Bogle, Senior Transportation Planner with RPC.
Peter Coffin.
Peter Coffin, Kingston.
All right, Richard.
Rich McDermott, Hampton Falls.
Stephen.
Stephen Gerardo, Greenland.
All right. Tim Moore.
Tim Moore from Plasto.
All right. Danya.
Danya Sigley Rye.
All right. Lucy.
Lucy St. John, New Hampshire DOT Bureau of Planning.
All right. Mike Whitten.
Mike Whitten, Manchester Transit and CART.
All right. Ken Lachaw.
Ken Lachaw from Newington.
All right. Bill Watson.
Bill Watson, New Hampshire DOT Bureau of Planning.
Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
Christian.
Christian Matthews, Transportation GIS Analyst, RPC.
Dave Sharples.
Dave Sharples, Exeter, New Hampshire.
All right. Tavis.
Tavis, Chatham, New Hampshire, Town Planner.
All right. Tim White.
Tim White, New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services.
All right. And Chris Cross.
Chris Cross, Natinehead Planning Board.
All right. Okay. There's that. All right. So next item is minutes of the 6/25 TAC meeting. That was attachment 1 that went out to members.
I'll move that we accept the minutes as written.
Do I have a second?
That's Peter Coffin.
Thanks, Peter.
I'll second it, Steve Gerardo.
All in favor?
All right.
Roll call again.
We got to do a roll call.
Yep.
All right. All right. I'm going to go through the voting members in the order that I have them on my participants list here. Peter Coffin.
Yes.
Stephen Gerardo.
Yes.
Ken Lachaw.
Yes.
Tim Moore.
Yes.
Danya.
Yes.
Mike Whitten.
Yes.
Richard.
Yes.
Dave Sharples.
Yes.
All right. Tavis.
Yes.
Tim White.
Yes.
And then either Lucy or Bill for DOT.
I abstain.
Okay. I believe that's all the voting members at this point. Yeah, I think I got everybody. Nope. Chris Jacobs from Hampton is just joining us. So, but anyways, so, okay. So minutes are all set.
Okay. Project solicitation and prioritization process and project selection criteria weighting.
Okay, so I am going to share my screen and bring up a presentation. As I was saying, it's a little bit of a complicated process. If there are questions, absolutely feel free. Like I said, I built in a couple of points to stop and just sort of reflect and make sure that everybody's on the same page as to what we're proposing to do and how we're proposing to do it. So. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is our project solicitation and prioritization process for our long-range transportation plan, as well as the state 10-year plan. So it's sort of dual purposes for us. Just a quick sort of overview of how the process works, or the sort of a flow chart and of how we go from now until getting a finalized set of projects. The first thing is we solicit projects from our communities and regional transit agencies. We've done that. We started that process at least. When projects come in, they are reviewed and classified into groups based on scale. That's that local, regional, and interregional groupings. So we split the projects into 3 groups and evaluate them according to the project selection criteria that we have. Create a short list of projects from each of those groups. Last round, we did the top 5 projects from each of those groups. And from that, we select a single prioritized list of projects to be presented to DOT as our candidate projects list for the 10-year plan. So the TAC reviews that list and comes up with that initial single list of priorities, which is then, once the TAC approves that, it goes to the policy committee for review and approval. And those are then submitted to DOT for engineering and cost review over the late fall and winter. And then once those are returned to us in February sometime with the updated information provided by DOT, we are then need to produce a final sort of fiscally constrained list of projects to submit for as our priorities for the 10-year plan. So all of that is going to occur over about the next 6 months or so. Right now we're at the very beginning of the process. We've sent out the project solicitation a week or so ago. And so projects will be due back to us by September 1st. We're working through the project development and classification piece of it, which is from some background. I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. Here today at the TAC meeting, our July TAC meeting, we're setting our project selection process into place just to make sure that everybody is aware of what that is and how it's all working, as well as doing the criteria weighting piece of it. At the policy committee meeting next month, those 2 pieces will be sort of finally approved by the MPO, and we will basically use those as going forward. This information, once we've set it today, I'll put the draft information up on the website so that if communities are interested, they can look at it with the understanding that it's draft and hasn't quite been finalized. During this whole time, we'll be having discussions with NHDOT about particular projects or about different ideas or different concept aspects of what we're doing, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about things. At the September TAC meeting, so I forget which day that exactly is, September 23rd, 24th, somewhere in that range. 24th, thank you. We'll be setting a list of draft priorities. This is that, the TAC will be presented with that short list from each of the groups, which will need to get translated into a single list of priority projects, which will then be approved at the October policy committee meeting, as projects are due to be submitted to NHDOT for engineering review on November 6th. So we need to have that all happen in September and October. DOT will be reviewing again November, December, January, and into February, I'm assuming, and we'll be looking to get information back in time to address our final priority list, limited to the fiscally constrained list, I'm sorry, at our February TAC meeting, and following that up with final approvals by the MPO at the March Policy Committee meeting. And we need to have our final prioritized list to DOT by the end of March of next year. So all of this is going to occur through that time frame. And then, by law, DOT is, of course, required to produce a draft 10-year plan by July 1st of next year. So that's what this is all shooting towards. Pause for a minute. Any questions or comments on what's been said so far?
It's spelled out pretty well in the document.
Okay, good. All right. I'm going to move forward then. So I sent out the guidance that we received from NHDOT to everyone. And just to sort of hit the high points of that, the sort of the important pieces that we look at. It's good to keep in mind that in almost all cases, the projects will be added to the last 10 years, last 2 years of the 10-year plan. I guess technically they are all added to the last 10 years of the 10-year plan too, but the last 2 years, and really construction is intended for those last 2 years. It is possible that you could get engineering or right-of-way phases programmed ahead of that, but the bulk of the funding and bulk of the work would probably be occurring in those last 2 years. Our target funding, target funding amount for our region is about 6.7 million, just under that, and that is our target for this round. It's the same as the last round. All costs for projects must include inflation at 2.8% per year, as well as a 10% indirect costs that are essentially a DOT administrative costs on that. And then all RPCs and DOT will be using a common set of project selection criteria. That's what we'll be discussing in a lot more detail here in a few minutes. And I did send out the full criteria document that goes through all the details of what are all the considerations of each of those each of those categories, and what the data is behind a lot of those pieces. So there's a lot of information available on that. As I've said, projects must go through engineering and cost review prior to being added to the 10-year plan. This can be done. RPCs basically have a choice to hire an engineer to do that work, or we can rely on DOT to do that for us, or to do the work for us. And so in this round, at least, we'll be asking DOT to do our engineering and cost review as opposed to hiring a private consultant. DOT has committed again to adding our prioritized projects to the draft 10-year plan as presented, assuming that it's within range of our budget target. Projects, though, must still go through the GASSET process, which, as we all know, is a political process, and projects can be added or removed as part of that. No guarantees as it goes in. Although in the most recent round, the projects that we prioritize to be added remain in the 10-year plan at this point. So we're feeling pretty confident that when projects get in there, they're likely to stay in. So the first piece of this is the call for projects, or the project solicitation. A request was sent out to communities and transit agencies a week or so ago. And we're asking them for a few things. We're asking them to look at any projects that they have already in the 10-year plan, in the long-range plan, and make sure that those are still priorities. We're asking them to provide any sort of updated information available regarding any of these existing projects that they have. And then third, we're asking if they have any newly identified projects or transportation issues that they want to submit projects for. And then, beyond that, if there's any sort of issues that have been identified, but there isn't really a project explicitly developed to address it, maybe it's a bigger picture kind of issue, we want to hear about those so we can at least incorporate that into the planning aspect of things, even if there's not a distinct project. And we do have a new web-based form for submitting new projects. It is based in Microsoft Forms. It was developed by all of the RPCs and DOT together. It's a little bit of a simplified form, so it should be easier for communities to fill in the information on that. Once we've gotten through the project solicitation piece and we have all the projects in and actually sort of ongoing at the same time to some degree, staff will be going through a project development and classification process. We'll be looking at all the projects that we have in our long range plan and looking at to whether we should keep them in the long range plan. There are projects that we would consider dropping if there's no community input, or if we don't have a defined scope or cost for a project, we might keep it in or move it into what's called an illustrative category. And basically an illustrative project is a concept where maybe you're missing scope, a detailed scope, or you're missing cost information, but sort of the general idea of what is desired. But the important thing is that doesn't count against your fiscal constraint. And so it's just sort of here's an idea we have for a project, but we haven't quite defined it well enough to count it yet. It's essentially what that comes down to. So we'll be going through all of the projects, both new and existing, to check and for updated data and completeness, making sure that the scopes make sense and scope descriptions make sense, looking at costs, looking for projects that are clearly underestimated in terms of their costs and trying to come up with a better idea on that so that we, going into the project selection piece of this, that we have the best idea that we can about what projects are what their costs are going to be. As part of this, we also classify projects into those three groups that I had mentioned earlier, local, regional, and interregional groups. Currently, there's about 80 plus projects that are in our long range plan that are classified into these three groups. And you can see that distribution there on that small table. This helps us sort of balance competing needs and priorities. It means that a small local Main Street style project isn't necessarily competing directly with widening on I-95 or I-93 or something large like that. And it just gives us a little bit of a balance to look at different aspects of the needs around the region. And I'll go through exactly how we sort of work with those three categories here in a minute. So, and then the final question that we ask when we're doing as part of this sort of development and classification process is the project a fit for the 10-year plan as a standalone project? Is it ready for the 10-year plan? Is it something that's not needed for 20 years or 30 years? Or is it something that's needed tomorrow? And it might be better to find a separate grant program or a different program than the 10-year plan for it. So we just try to make that assessment for projects as best we can. So the three project groupings, you've all seen this graphic before. It just really tries to lay out what the differences are between these groups. And I think it sort of makes sense from a real basic perspective in that, a local project, there's a different focus on that than there is for something at sort of a regional level or an interregional level. So at the local level, we're focusing on safety and access and multimodal connections within the communities, whereas regional projects, we're looking at connections between communities and activity centers, think places like Keys where we have a big job center or other places like that. And then at the interregional level, we're looking at how well we're connected to the rest of New Hampshire and the rest of New England and beyond. And so those are projects that tend to be on, I-95, I-93, the 101, the interregional bus and rail transit, that we have, so whereas, the local projects are more smaller scale, they're on, sort of Main Street type projects. And the regional projects sort of sit somewhere in the middle. They're mostly on the state highways, the connections between communities. So there's, just different focus for each of those. And that comes through to some degree in the criterion that are maybe more important at each level. Safety is, of course, important sort of across the board, but at the local level, equity and accessibility becomes more of an issue, natural hazard resiliency, whereas at the interregional level, it's more about mobility and how quickly and efficiently can you move people between these areas, the regions and the states. So, any comments, questions on that last little bit?
So far, so good, David.
Excuse me, this is Danya. I do have a very quick question. David, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. This is more of a process question because I've only just gone through this process with you for the first time with the committee. When you, going back to your first slide, you solicited, thank you, the one previous to that, sorry. But anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that when you solicit new projects from the different communities, to whom do they go, and is the representative on the committee copied or provided feedback?
So the solicitation is sent to, it was sent to town administrators, planning board chairs, board of selectmen or city council chairs, and it may have been also sent to like administrative assistants for those. I usually copy the TAC and the policy committee on that notice. And I'm thinking maybe I did not do that this time because I think you're the second person who's mentioned that they hadn't seen it. So after this meeting is over, I will forward to the TAC the solicitation request that I sent out to communities just to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Oh, I appreciate that. And then therefore for RYE, it would be any one of those possible recipients, or are they all on the recipient list?
They are all on the recipient list. So it gets sort of a pretty broad spread of interests. But I in the end, the project needs to come through probably the board of selectmen, to get that approval to move forward. But yeah, it can come from anywhere within the community, really.
Okay, and then one last question on that. Yep. Did you receive any feedback from anyone in RYE?
Not so far.
Okay.
I've heard from folks in Greenland and Stratham and Newington so far.
All right, great. I'll look forward to the email you'll send out, and then if I have any further questions, I'll reach out. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you.
And David, just a quick question on the revenue, the 6.67 million that you had targeted budget.
Yes.
Is that still reasonable given the lack of revenue these days?
It's well, that's probably not a question that I can answer.
Right. But I mean, it's
the bulk of the funding, and this is for this part of the 10-year plan, and this money is federal funds, and that we are certainly making assumptions on the federal funding available out in 10 years, but generally that has been available. The federal funding has been pretty consistent. Crossing my fingers on that, but they're probably also not looking to cut funding in the current economic environment.
Right.
So that being said, this is 10 years out, and we don't quite ever know what's going to happen until things are much closer. So there is a possibility that projects could get delayed or dropped entirely if funding changes drastically. For instance, the FAST Act, which is the current federal legislation that sets the amount of funding available to states, that includes sort of a drop of a 40% drop if they can't figure out how to fund it, at the end. I think they've gotten beyond that now, and they're working on the next replacement for that. But if that drop goes into effect, for some reason, we'd have to, DOT and all the RPCs would probably have to reevaluate what projects could be funded at that point.
David, can Lucy add anything to this?
I don't know, Lucy or Bill will absolutely probably have some insight on that.
I would basically say that, we're moving forward with the assumptions that, as Dave said there with the funding, but as in the COVID situation and anything in the future, there's always a possibility of changes. So I think, as we've talked about before, there's a lot of coordination that goes on, and, we would keep you abreast of that. But as of right now, we're moving forward with the process as we have done in the past. And the regional allocations are similar to what were last year. And so that's where we are. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
It sounded good.
Okay.
Bill, did you have anything to add?
I think the only thing I would add is that, we also recognize everything Lucy said is true. This was a big discussion point at the last, as part of the kickoff for the last 10-year plan update with the Governor's Advisory Commission. And so there is, I guess there will be that conversation at the beginning of the next 10-year plan process as well. And the revenue assumptions may change, but this, we provided a number of scenarios. We are confident right now that Congress will continue the FAST Act with some sort of replacement that will look similar. If things should change, either increased or decreased, I think what we've done with the planning commissions is certainly we have that target out there for everybody to present proposals up to that funding level. Most of the regional planning commissions also add in additional projects, one or two, so that if there is additional funding, we can consider that as well for each region. But if there's a significant decrease in funding yet, we will have to come back and have a further conversation with everyone.
Thanks, Bill. All right, move forward then. All right, so the project selection process. This involved, it's really sort of a 4 or a 5-step process even, and some of it goes back to the project classification piece of it, and then the development of the data on projects. So when we're looking at project selection, we look at a few things. We look at, first, is the project feasible? Does it address a clearly defined need? Is it a reasonable approach in both scope and cost? Is somebody proposing to tunnel under the Piscataqua River, that kind of thing, where it's just way out of line for what we might be able to do? And is it likely, given what we know about the project, to get required resource agency permits so that it's environmentally permittable, I guess is what we're saying. So that's one piece that we look at. We look at support behind it. Has there been demonstrated local support? Is it in planning documents? Have there been public hearings or meetings about it? Does it conform to existing plans for both the region at the regional level and at the local level, as well as the state in some cases. And so those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. And then third piece that we look at is the project eligible for federal funding programs. And there are some limitations on that. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but basically any project that's on a state highway is mostly likely to be federally eligible for federal funding. Projects on local streets, we have to, in certain circumstances, some are eligible and some are not. So there just has to be a little bit of, we have to look at the scope of the project and where it's located specifically to make sure that everything is eligible for those federal funds. And then the fourth piece of it is we apply that project selection criteria that we're working on right now. So. Realize this had built-in back. There we go. What is happening? All right, so for this year, new for 21 on the the project selection criteria, there's new criteria that are addressing economic development as well as equity, environmental justice, and accessibility. So we've got 2 new criteria that are in the mix. At the same time, the alternative modes criteria that we had last round has been dropped as sort of a standalone category, although most of the aspects that were included in alternative modes are really incorporated into between the economic development and the equity, environmental justice, and accessibility measures. So while it's gone away as a standalone, it's really the intent behind that is incorporated into other criteria. So, and as you've all seen, there's a lot more detailed and complete guidance that was developed by the RPCs and NHDOT. So, I hate these disappearing things. So, I don't know why it's not going forward. There we go. All right. To delete that slide and rebuild it. So, you've all seen this as well. This went out with the TAC agenda. These are the categories of the project selection criteria. There are 8 categories listed alphabetically here: economic development, equity, environmental justice, and accessibility, mobility, natural hazard resiliency, network significance, safety, state of repair, and support. All right, and each of these has a definition, and sort of a general overall definition of how we believe those are applicable to projects in the region. So within each of those categories, there are multiple criterion that we're looking at. And within each of those criteria, there are different things that we can focus on to sort of form the bulk of and sort of inform the decision making. So within economic development, we have an economic development piece, which is looking at accessibility to regional activity centers, such as employment zones and tourism destinations. Whereas there's also looking at freight movement. Is the project addressing a freight bottleneck, for instance, or other limitation on freight movement? Each of these criteria, each of these categories have multiple criteria within them, and those have been sort of selected out of all the options within each that are in that guidance document. So there could be more of these, we could do less as well, but this is where we're starting with each of these. So I'm not going to go through these. This is something that everybody has seen as well in each, so I'm not going to go through them individually, but they're within the 8 categories. There are 2 in each. Maybe I'll just run through real quick without going into the focus areas. Under equity and accessibility, we're looking at impacts on underserved population and impact on access and accessibility. Under mobility, we're looking at facility purpose and mobility intervention. What is the project proposing to do to improve mobility? Natural hazard resiliency, we're looking at, is the site of the project at an area that is at risk from natural hazards? And then what is the project proposing to do to mitigate the problem? Under network significance, we're looking at both traffic volume, how much traffic is at the location, as well as how important is the facility to the transportation network in the area. Safety, we're looking at both past performance, what's the crash history there, as well as what the project is proposing to do to address the safety issue. State of repair looks at both current infrastructure condition, what is the condition of the pavement or the bridge, et cetera, as well as will the project result in reduced maintenance requirements going forward. And that's an important aspect. Under support, there's actually multiple categories that we're going to look at here, but really it's looking at local, regional, and statewide support for a project. And then in some cases, we want to look at, is this a newly identified sort of need that we need to address sort of on an immediate time frame? So went through that pretty quickly. Any comments or questions on those criteria and the categories? All right, hearing none, I'm gonna push forward again. So the point we're at here now today, and the work that I need the TAC to do, is helping to set the criteria weights. And setting, so there's 2 pieces of this. They're setting criterion weights and they're setting category weights, right? So So there are 8 categories. The total for all 8 categories has to equal 100% of the score. And we're breaking things up into these 3 groups. So we may have slightly different weights for each of the local, regional, and interregional. Within each category, the total should also equal 100. So each criterion within the category should total up to 100. And the percentages on those, we're going to use the same across the board. So if, for instance, under safety, the crash history is worth 50% of the score within the safety category, it'll be worth 50% of the score at the local, regional, and interregional levels. So we just sort of keep that consistent across the board. So just a quick sort of overview of how we've started this. We did send out that survey to TAC members. 15 folks completed at least part of the survey, and that includes myself. And so I'm just going to give just sort of an overview of the math of how we sort of set these initial weights for each criteria, so that just everybody has a basic understanding of how it goes. So going from left to right here, I've just set up some example criteria here of criteria A, B, and C, right? So what I did is tally the number of votes at each rank. So for the number of votes, so this is assuming that there are 20 total votes that I broke into, you know, assuming, and again, this is all an example. So how many people said that criteria A should be the top ranked criteria? How many people said criteria B should be the top ranked criteria? And how many said criteria C should be the top ranked? And again, second and third. So in criteria A's case, 5 people said it should be first, 10 people said it should be second, 5 people said it should be third, for a total of 20 votes. And that repeats all down through. All right. So then that is broken up into the percent share that each criteria, or that at each rank, right? So 25% of the votes in criteria A were for it to be the top ranked. So we take that and multiply it by the points given to each rank. And of course, the higher ranking means more points. So 3 points for first rank, 2 points for second rank, 1 point for third rank. And we come up with a weighted score by multiplying the number of votes and by the score. So it basically, you know, so criteria A has a total weighted score of 2, which puts it in second place in the ranking. Then we take from there, and this is the last really piece of it, we say, okay, so the total weighted score of all the criteria together is 6. So 2 is a third of that. So it's the weighted share of criteria 2 is 33 1/3%. Criteria B, which was ranked first, has a slightly higher score, so it's going to get 37.5%. And criteria C has a slightly lower piece of that, overall 6 points, so it's 29%. And then for simplicity, those numbers are all just rounded to the nearest whole. So I'm just gonna stop here. Does anybody, I mean, it's a little bit of math here, but I don't know if anybody has any questions for how I went through that. All right, not hearing anything, so I'm gonna move on before anybody has a chance to jump in. So we did receive some additional comments from folks filling out the survey on what they felt was important. Sorry, got muted there. What they felt was important and pieces that they looked at while making these selections and prioritizing these different aspects. And I've included those here. You know, looking at the need for an easy commute was important to one respondent. Looking at making sure that we're looking forward and not just what the transportation network is today, it was important to another respondent. You know, considering the overlap between categories was how another person looked at it, and how they approached the prioritization. And then another respondent was focused on the safety for pedestrian bike pathways. And then finally, a final correspondent here, respondent here, who I did shorten this comment to fit it all on one page, but looking at the condition, infrastructure condition as a priority. So just, you know, some additional feedback to feed into this process. So the draft weights that we produced, they're intended as a starting point for discussion. The TAC does not have to accept those. We can modify those if desired. And we can modify how both the criteria within a category are distributed, how the scores are distributed, or we can modify the overall categories and how they're distributed within the overall score. The key things that we need to keep in mind is that the total within each category needs to equal 100%. For the most part, that's very easy. There are usually 2 criteria within each category, so it's pretty easy to make sure that that equals 100%. And then the other thing is that the sum of all the categories together needs to equal 100%. So I'm going to actually approach this sort of backwards from how the survey was set up and talk about the individual criteria first, because I think that's a little bit simpler, because it's usually, like I said, in most cases, it's just comparing pairs and making sure that the distribution is acceptable. So here are the 2 criterion within each category, except for support, which actually has 3, and how the survey respondents weighted things. For instance, under economic development, again, these are all listed alphabetically. Under economic development, between the 2, the access to activity centers and freight and goods movement, access to activity centers was weighted slightly higher than the freight and goods movement, 58 to 42%. Under equity and accessibility, expanding transportation choices was ranked substantially more often the top choice over removing barriers to access. So it's a bit of a more heavily weighted distribution between the 2. And if you go through each of these, they are essentially more or less evenly distributed amongst the different pieces. Under mobility, the location being congested was weighted slightly higher than the approach being proposed. Under natural hazard resiliency, the risk mitigation strategy was weighted slightly higher than the actual exposure. Under network significance, the facility importance, or the importance of that roadway or facility to the regional transportation network, was rated more important slightly than the volume of traffic on that road or facility. Under safety, the proposed safety measure was slightly more important than past safety performance. Under the state of repair, the current infrastructure condition was slightly more important than reducing future maintenance requirements. And then under support here, where we actually have 3 different aspects to consider, the breakdown is more, you know, it's less of a 50-50 split. Local priority came out on top with 45%, and then regional support, or, you know, is the project supported by the regional long-range transportation plan, and whether the project is a newly identified need, are much closer together at 29 and 26%.
David, would you be kind enough to send that chart to us?
Yes, I believe that the information that I sent out,
it was in the email we got.
Yeah, in yesterday, it's a slightly different chart, but it's the same information. Yesterday afternoon, I sent it out via email, just a 1-pager that shows all of this information.
Okay. Oh, with the numbers, David?
With the numbers. Yep.
Oh, okay. I didn't check yesterday.
The one caveat I will say is that I had a very small math error in the categories on what I sent out yesterday. So the numbers that you're going to see on the categories today, they're slightly different than what was sent out yesterday. It's mostly a percentage up or down in a couple of cases, because I realized that my numbers did not add up to 100% when I was pulling this all together. And so I had to do a quick math redo this morning. But anyways, we'll go over that. So I guess maybe at this point, before we get into the categories, is everybody feel like these are good distributions of these different criterion within each category?
Absolutely.
Is there anybody who has heartburn about any of them?
Do you want to take a tally of?
You're muted, Dave. There you go.
Yes.
All right. All right. So did anybody? Everybody was muted there. I don't know if anybody was trying to say anything. Chris, maybe Chris Jacobs.
Yeah, I've been trying to say something for quite a while. I've been muted. I don't want to. I'm sorry. I have to go back. I don't want to beat this with a death. I just don't want this to slide this year. And I understand you said you sent out the solicitation. With the solicitation, was there an application?
There was a link to the online application form.
There was a link.
Yes.
Did Greenland respond?
I have not heard directly back from Greenland, although I have been talking with your planner about projects. So I know he's they're pulling information together to try to submit the Bayside Winnicott Route 33 intersection project.
Okay. Be nice to get a copy of that because I'm the only one going to a meeting. I don't see anybody else here.
Yeah. And Stephen, I'll send out after the meeting. I'll send out what I sent out to the communities. And I apologize. I normally copy that to the TAC and the policy committee members, and I must not have done that. Chris Jacobs, did you have a comment to make? Nope. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to make the call that everybody seems okay with this distribution within each of the categories. Okay. So now the more complicated piece, or maybe the piece where there is some more opportunity to weigh in and redistribute, change things around a bit. Looking at the criteria or the category weights, so each of those 8 overall criteria, this is the information I sent out to you yesterday afternoon. If you look on the regional and the interregional categories, anything that's underlined, the number has changed slightly from yesterday. And again, that was due to my poor math skills. This is the current breakdown as weighted by the 15 folks that replied to the survey. The numbers here between the 3 categories, the 3 groupings are very similar across the board. I think the addition of an 8th category of criteria has sort of caused everything to sort of be closer together. You know, dividing 100% by 8 versus dividing 100% by 7. So we have our numbers a little closer together than last year in terms of how the distribution is done. But this was the results of the survey, and you know, we can you know, talk about how people might want to see things ranked differently, or given more importance or less importance. And so I just sort of, I guess at this point, open up the floor to allow people to weigh in on those types of things.
Hey Dave, this is Bill. I know you're probably expecting this because we've had some conversations offline. Do you mind if I ask the TAC a question?
Sure. I don't mind, I guess. Yeah.
So one of the things that, and you explained it very well. So the way that the process is set up now, you'd be evaluating between the different categories with the criteria weights. You'd have essentially an evaluated or a scored list of priorities out of each of the individual categories. And then there's a process through which the TAC and the policy committee blend those into one priority list to come to us for the 10-year plan. And earlier on, you described the GASSET process as kind of political in the way that they decide what to do with the projects that are put forward to them. Would you call that blending political process within the region, with the work the TAC and the policy committee does? And there's a reason for me asking the question. Between the categories, there's no more than 3% difference from the low and the high. You know, if we're looking at economic development, local category gives it 10%, regional gives it 13, or support from 7 to 10 with 8 in between. When you're actually scoring a project, that doesn't make any real difference in the overall score from our collective experience in evaluating projects. So we're comfortable if that's what the TAC and the policy committee want to do. But in terms of taking 3 different sets of weights and having to figure out how to combine them all and then put them forward versus using one set of weights for all the categories, there's the opportunity for the TAC and the policy committee to be opened up to some more scrutiny about how they blended those categories projects if you use different weights. That's the conversation Tim and I have had, and I'm comfortable with that moving forward if that's what the TAC and the policy committee feel. I just wanted to put it out there for everyone's consideration.
Good. Thanks, Bill.
I'm happy to jump in just a little bit, Bill, to add some to your question. Is to your initial point is like, no, I don't think it isn't really a political issue or a political influence at the regional level. What we're trying to do, and I'm saying this out loud again for the TAC to hear, is that we're trying to get this 10-year plan process to be a process that addresses the needs of our long-range planning priorities. And the extra effort that Dave and Scott do to categorize projects and go through all this, the subtleties and nuance of slightly different weightings is such that when we then look at these, these 3 lists of projects that we have internally, we can then decide, what, as a TAC, and I say we, I mean the TAC and the MPO, can then decide what makes sense to best align with our long range plan. And it gives us that flexibility to know that we're taking the best ranked projects or the most likely to fit with the needs of the long range plan from each of the categories. And as I said to you, and I'll put it out there again to the TAC, that I think this approach really instills confidence in our communities, and that the process is fair as such that a small project has an opportunity against some of the larger projects. And I would say it's not political. I think it's really, we're trying to be data driven and trying to have a needs approach and not just make this a wish list of Christmas projects, as I said earlier. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. And if anyone else wants to weigh in, feel free.
This is Danya, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely, Danya.
Thank you. I appreciate Tim's comments and actually agree with him on his position. I was confused when the word political was presented, and I'm sure it was perhaps just a broad description of what might be meant. Can someone explain to me why this is becoming, and I'm not trying to be naive here, but I like the fact that there's local, regional, and interregional representation, because here perhaps there's been a melding, and you can kind of see that in the local, regional, and interregional, the priorities are pretty much similar, give or take, some margin for error there on percentages. But it does give the view that we are representing, hopefully, the local, regional, and interregional concerns and or priorities. Why the word political, and why is it political? Can someone explain that to me?
Danya, I use the word political, so I don't mind explaining why I did.
Thank you.
I get and I support the evaluation of local projects, regional projects, and interregional projects. But in terms of the 10-year plan, the department's expectation to each of the 9 regional planning commissions, not just Rockingham, is that we only get one list of priorities. So within the Rockingham Planning Commission region, for the long-range transportation purposes, you might have separate lists of priorities for local, regional, and interregional projects. But at some point in time, the TAC has to make or should be making a recommendation, and the policy committee has to make a recommendation on how that becomes one list, not 3.
Okay,
So-
that's clearer. Thank you.
Right, and I can tell you how we did it last round. So the ideal is that we select the top priority from each group to be added to the 10-year plan, assuming that everything fits within the target budget of 6.7 million approximately. For the local and regional projects, that's generally not an issue. As often those are projects, ranging from under $1 million to $1 or $2 million. The bigger interregional projects, we tend to sometimes run into issues where they're all very large, multi-million dollar projects. And so it sometimes can become problematic to include an interregional project. So that's where we have to start to make decisions. And what we did last time was the interregional project that was selected was like a $8 or $9 million project, if I remember correctly. And so the decision was made to pick starting at the top of the local and regional list and working our way down and to fill that $6.7 million. So the decision was made at the TAC to we had the decision of picking one large project or multiple smaller projects, and the TAC and the policy committee last time went with picking multiple smaller projects. Will that happen this time? I'm not sure. I don't know what the outcomes are yet. But like I said, the ideal is that we would pick the top ranked project from each group and then work our way down until the money is gone.
Right.
And and that's in the TAC last time there was a little bit of, well, let's pull in priority 5 or priority 6, that kind of thing, just to make the number, the ultimate budget work. And that's what it came down to in the end last time. And
Okay.
I'm assuming we'll have some sort of variation of that this time as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And thank you. That's very, very helpful to both of you. Thanks.
Can I add one more thing to that? Just so to the political references, there's a long history down here that you haven't been around for long enough yet to get. But what I want to add to what Dave was just saying, and probably to hopefully help Bill and the DOT feel a little bit better, is sort of reiterating what I said earlier, is that our effort in what we're trying to do is keep in mind the goals of our long range plan for the region and what the priorities are for the region as we make these selections to see which projects are best in line with what we're trying to accomplish for the transportation system as a whole, and just make sure that we really keep the planning process and the documents that we develop as part of this. And it's not just the politics stay out of it by it not being, I'll pick on a town. Can I pick on Portsmouth? I don't know if they're in the room, but just because Portsmouth is the bigger community that they have the political sway, we're not just picking their projects for that sake. It's about making sure it's fitting within the direction we're trying to take the region with the long range plan. So
Great. Thank you for the history. It's very helpful as well. Thank you.
So Dave,
it's long.
Dave, when you say you try to pick the top project in each group, are you talking about by group, is that within each of those categories or within local, regional, interregional?
Yes, the second, the local, regional, interregional. Sorry, I keep using group interchangeably, and I shouldn't, or category. It's the local, regional, or interregional classification. So we try to pick the top project from each of those, local, regional, interregional, and then work our way down through the priorities. So the last round, we scored the projects, and I brought to the TAC the top 5 projects in each local, regional, and interregional. And we sort of worked our way through those lists and picked the priorities from that, starting at the top of the list and working our way down. And again, it really came down to the first choice between picking one very large project or multiple smaller projects. And then it was about fitting projects within the budget.
So I guess my question, just being my first time through this with RPC, it seems like with 3 kind of groupings and 8 categories within each one, we've created this set of 24 variables. But to Bill's earlier point, from a math perspective, there's not a whole lot of difference between any of these. I wonder if this is just overcomplicating it to the point where, like in your example, the TAC really can't wade through this. We rely on staff to come up with a short list and do a lot of the number crunching, and then we just look at the top. But if people were interested, if a town wanted to kind of see more in depth, it'd be really hard to do. And for a math change of like safety, 17, 16, 17. I mean, does that 1% change only in the regional level really change anything when we have to combine this into one list ultimately at the end?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that is certainly, you know, the numbers this year are closer together than they were last round. There was more market difference between categories and between the classifications last round. And some of that I think is due to, we have one more category of criterion. So rather than splitting up 100% by 7, we're splitting up 100% by 8. So that's going to naturally bring the numbers a little closer together. But yeah, I would have expected to see a little bit of a broader distribution across the 3 classifications than what we received, you know, back from TAC members. So you know, it's every time we do this, we get a different slightly different outcome. So you know, sometimes I think we're going to be close together, and other times we're not.
If I can jump in again, Dave, on that, just because I appreciate both Bill's idea and Mike's sort of reiteration of that. I think, as I said earlier in my comments, is that from the past history, and we can go way back into history of, you know, when we were doing a terrible job, quite frankly, years ago, of, you know, making this just a wish list and every 2 years it's Christmas for new projects, to where we are now. What I feel like we've done, like, is we've instilled confidence in our communities, in the sense that, as I said earlier, you know, by going through this extra effort, and yeah, I fully acknowledge what you and Bill pointed out, is that these weightings are much closer. But our experience has been that a community that has a small local project that wants to put it forward, I think can have a little bit more confidence now that there's an opportunity based on not just the weighting and the ranking, but the discussion that comes out of that afterwards. And, you know, it's just worked. And to me, having that confidence in the local communities is so critical to, you know, doing the job that we need to do, that it seems to me that it's worth that extra effort and nuance of the staff to give you guys that breakdown the way we're doing it.
Yeah, and I guess I might just, I don't want to drag this on. I think I'm asking the question poorly. I like that you categorize them by local, regional, interregional for exactly that point. That stops the local smaller projects from having to compete with these giant multi-million dollar ones. My question is, if you're separating by category already, doesn't that already accomplish that? They're not butting up against each other. So the need for this ever so slightly different statistical approach seems like it's duplicative. You've already separated them out, so they're not going head to head.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. We could split them into the 3 classifications and use the same weighting across the board, but keep them split into these 3, the local, regional, interregional, and come up with the priorities and then pull them all together at the end, but use the same weighting. You know, that's an option as well, for sure.
Seems like that would put us at a lot less opportunity for someone to come and say, well, okay, why in safety is it 1% less important at the regional level than it is everywhere else?
Yeah.
And I don't know what the answer would be.
Again, I would say.
I mean, I think the reason that it's 1% less important is that there was a process where every TAC member had the opportunity to weigh in and establish weights. And so there's been a clear process in establishing these. As Dave said, in the last cycle, through a similar process, there was a wider point spread that you saw. For example, I think network significance on the local projects was down closer to 10, and on the interregional projects, it was up closer to 20, just based on, say, for local projects, perhaps being a higher weight placed on in the last cycle rather than the equity and accessibility criterion. There was a criterion for alternative modes, and that was weighted fairly highly at the local level and rather low at the interregional level. So there was a desire to think about different types of projects that might come forward in those different scale categories and give the TAC members opportunities to put different weights on the criteria, recognizing the different types of projects that might come forward at the different scales. As it happens in this cycle, those numbers ended up fairly close. Last cycle, they were more divergent, and next cycle, they might be more divergent again.
Right, and that's the part of the advantage of that is, I think, is giving you all that opportunity. I mean, it's truly driven by the TAC, and like Scott, that's a great point. The subtlety this time is the numbers just fell out the same, whereas they were much different in the last round.
This is Tim Moore. I've gone through this cycle of looking at the criteria for, I guess, a number of years now, and I think the last 2 or 3, the TAC really did a really good job of vetting the projects. Not only looking just at the numbers, but at the projects themselves. And so, I mean, I think it's worked through pretty well. And I think we've all cooperated for projects that have been in our town that haven't been weighted as high as they might be. People have, cooperated and agreed that, yeah, maybe this project should wait a couple of years, or no, we overlooked something and we think the project should be moved ahead. So I think we've had really, really good discussions, and the final votes, I think, have been fair. And I think last year, all of the projects that we advanced, promoted, did get advanced to the 10-year plan. So I think that kind of proves the point that we did our homework pretty well.
All right, thanks, Tim. Any other people, anybody else want to weigh in?
I guess I'm quietly curious if it becomes too hard because these numbers are too close together, and the percentage basis. I'm wondering if we get to the pinch point of creating one list. Is it possible TAC could consider last year's breakdowns and this year's? Or is that just become too difficult because there's an 8th criteria now?
Yeah, it becomes challenging because of the dropping of the alternative modes criteria and the addition of 2 different ones this round. It gets challenging to try to do that. I mean, we could certainly merge, sort of average these out as it's done here. I mean, there's different ways that we could do it. We could, you could pick one of the distributions. The TAC could say, okay, we really like how the local is distributed. Let's use that for all 3. We could keep, so I think we have kind of 3 options maybe going forward. We keep them as they are, We take one of these three and use that for all three. We could do, average across the board, which shouldn't be terribly challenging to do given how close everything is. And again, I would round things off to the nearest whole percentage. I guess the fourth option is we can dig into these criteria and modify them as the TAC sees fit to say, either increase the spread or decrease the spread, or however. So I'm open to any of those options.
Dave, could I propose maybe for consideration a fifth option? And going back to a comment that I made to the application process or to the survey process, that there is a significant amount of overlap in the current categories. And I like the categories, don't get me wrong. But if you wanted to perhaps get a more macro picture of the importance or the prioritization of the categories, is it possible to say, well, some of these categories, if it's important in, let's say, equity and accessibility is important, what is the next category that could also be tied to that, and grouping them a little bit if there is an overlap? Just a suggestion, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yep. Yeah. Yes. I follow what you're saying, Danya. We do need to keep these 8 categories as those, because that's the statewide process, and we do have to account for each of these eight categories. So we can't really merge them. But yes, you're right. There absolutely is. There's overlap between equity and accessibility and economic development. Between economic development and mobility to some extent, between natural hazards and safety, network significance and mobility overlap to some degree. So yeah, there is some overlap on these.
And maybe not for purposes of reporting it, as we must do now that I understand that. So that this is set in stone, that can't be changed. But for purposes perhaps, and not asking anyone to do more work than is necessary, but even for our discussion as a committee, if people are wondering really what is going to be the most likely priority at the local, regional, interregional, if you start grouping them or discussing them as a group. But just a thought again, as I said.
All right, thank you.
Dave, this is Chris Cross with a question.
Sure, Chris.
This question is really more for Bill Watson, the DOT. Bill, your comments made me think that our question: are you seeing inflation in the projects put forward by each region? Let me give you an example of that. Each region has a certain dollar figure threshold to be within and move projects forward. But are you seeing that your consolidation or consideration is difficult to make the one list because a particular region may have a much higher mean for all their projects, such as out of 10, Rockingham may have the average projects nominated are 8s, whereas Coos County may have projects nominated that are 6s. Thanks.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Chris.
In short, I'm just wondering if you see the different regions providing their project nominations as much high, all their total score ranked much higher on average. Say if we nominate 4 projects and they're all within our budget threshold for each region, but you're seeing they're ranked between 8.5 and 9.5, and Coos County's region sends projects within their category that are all rank between 5.5 and 7.5. Is that making your process more difficult to consolidate into one list?
Okay, I understand now. No, because what we are doing is we're looking at each region individually at that point. And so it may be that Rockingham Planning Commission has much higher scoring evaluated projects based on the weights that they're using. And North Country Council may have very poorly scoring projects. But our commitment to each of the 9 regional planning commissions has been to try and allocate that amount of funding, in Rockingham's case 6.7 million, to priorities that they have developed for the region. And North Country Council will have an allocation for themselves as well, or any of the other regions. And so North Country's projects may, if we were to look at them compared to Rockingham, they may look terrible on paper in terms of evaluation score. But that's the commitment from the department, and that's the direction that the GASSET committee has asked us to move forward with, is that we do allocate funding consistently across the different regions.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right. I'm going to throw another thing up on the screen here. I took the, if everybody can see this Excel spreadsheet, I just took the 3 sets of classifications for, and the scores for each criteria, or the weights for each criteria, and I just did an average across the board just to allow people to have a comparison for that. So you can see it doesn't make a huge difference between them. So that, I think that is a viable alternative to basically keep the groupings but use the same criteria weights across the board. So I think that is an option. Like I said, other years we've had more of a spread, and it might not be quite the same, but I think in this case it may be a viable option for us.
Dave, I would say whatever, Lucy can vote if she wants to on behalf of the department, whatever, when you get to that point, whatever is decided here, I would encourage you in future rounds to take the same approach as you started with in looking at the different categories across each one. Because as you've pointed out, and Scott and Tim have pointed out, this allows for that conversation to happen across these categories or the classifications. And there may be times when the criteria or the categories do fall out very differently than what it is now. I would not suggest that you, whatever is recommended today, be the end all for the future.
All right. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate that support. All right. So let's see, where are we at? So that's really, where we're at is we need a TAC endorsement of a process to move forward. And we need TAC endorsement of the criteria weights and an approach for that as well. So those are the 2 things that I need from the TAC. I'm going to keep the spreadsheet up because it does have the average included as well. So I'd be willing to take a motion from a TAC member on an approach, or if anybody has any further thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
David, do you want a collective for both of those or singularly?
I'm not sure what you mean, Richard.
You had 2 points up there that you wanted us to vote on.
Okay. Yeah. I think let's do it collectively so we only have to go through the roll call once. I think the process, there's probably, it's pretty well laid out. I think there's a general agreement. We're in the midst of it. I think that's probably not the main issue that people are going to be concerned about. So I think really it's the setting these categories and which weights are we going to use? Are we going to keep them split? We're going to average them together. And I'd be willing to hear, any further thoughts that TAC members might have on the preferred approach. And maybe we can, maybe first thing would be to talk about and figure out, a general sort of maybe a
informal consensus on an approach, and then we'll pull it all together into a single motion for that approach, both, and then including the whole process as well as the approach on the criteria weights. How's that sound?
Wow.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. So maybe let's just get the criteria weights sorted sort of informally, and then we'll pull that into a motion that includes the process and the criteria weight approach. How does that sound?
Yes, a little better, David.
All right. Less roundabout way to get there. So yeah, I guess I'd be interested to hear from a TAC member on a starting point for an approach.
Well, based on the last feedback from Bill, I would recommend moving forward with the individual weightings and not the averages shown in the right column on the screen.
Okay, so using the individual weightings for each of the local, regional, and interregional.
Correct.
Okay.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
I'll second.
All right, so a couple people behind that. Maybe rather than doing a full, I'm sure how to proceed on this, whether it's more of a, does anybody have a counter argument? I guess maybe it's the, I'm not sure the best way to approach this, whether we want to talk about other options or whether we want to try to go forward with that.
Well, quite frankly, I don't think it's going to make a lot of difference. So I like the way it's laid out individually, so that I think we should just have a consensus agreement that we can move forward with that, and then we can have a motion for the actual vote on both items.
Okay, and just from on the back end of this, it's not really any additional work to run the 3 different scores than it is for each classification versus doing the average. It's all set up in a spreadsheet, so it's really a matter of just changing eight cell numbers, and so it doesn't add any more work for me really particularly.
So Dave, I have a question. So you're at this point, they're suggesting to maintain the individual categories and not average them. Is that what you're suggesting?
That is, yes, that is what is motion. That is what's on the table at this point, is maintaining the individual ones.
And David, you just said you wouldn't mind using all 4 columns.
Well, I wouldn't use all 4. What I would suggest, I guess, at this point, that we either use the first 3, the local, regional, interregional, as they're laid out, or the average applied to each of the 3 columns.
Okay, so the consensus right now is just 3 columns.
So,
Richard, you got just a point of order. So you do have if we're going to follow rules, you have a motion and a second. This seems to be the discussion. I don't know if you want to vote on that as, sort of call the question on the 3 columns and then move on to the next piece. I mean, I know you have to do 2 roll calls, or somehow you have to sort of morph that motion second to us to 1 vote, I think is what you're trying to get to, Dave, right?
Well, I was trying to simplify things into 1 vote, but maybe that's just not feasible.
It may be just faster, instead of trying to work out the technicalities of that, of avoiding the motion and withdrawing it. Just do a quick run through of the board, and then move on to the next.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see the participants list, and I'm going to just do that then. Okay. So the question is, at this point, the motion in the second was to use the individual weightings for each of the local, regional, and interregional classifications. Okay. Peter Coffin.
Yes.
Richard McDermott.
Nod your head, Richard.
I waved to him.
Richard, are you voting yes on this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mike Whitten?
No.
No, okay. 1 no, 2 yes. Ken Latchaw?
Yes.
All right. My order just shifted. What's going on? Tim Moore.
Yes.
Danya.
Yes.
Lucy.
No.
Okay. Peter, we already did. Tavis.
Yes.
Dave Sharples.
Yes.
Tim White.
Dave, I'm going to abstain.
Okay. I think that is all the voting members that we have on the line at this point. Looks like we lost Stephen Gerardo. I don't recall the final tally. I know there were 2 no votes, but more yes votes. So people have, it looks like at this point, we're moving forward with keeping the 3 classifications and individual scoring percentages for each. I think going forward for the next time we do this, I'll present the average as well, just as an option, just so that we can look at that again, because I think it's a valid approach. And frankly, it hadn't occurred to me, keeping the separate categories and then pulling them all together at the end with the same scoring. But going forward for this round, we're going to use the individual classifications and the individual project selection criteria for each set of classifications. So I guess technically we need a second vote then now on the overall process that I laid out, and that individual classifications. I guess that's already done. So
I'll move that we move the weighting criteria to the MPO as shown on your slide.
Oh, that's not.
And can we include the process of sort of scoring and approving projects as part of that as well? I mean, it was a little less clear that I needed a motion on that maybe, but.
Okay, yeah, that as you stated, that the whole process and weighting criteria.
So so it's basically the project selection, solicitation and selection process, and that includes the weighted criteria, the criteria weighting. So.
All right.
All right. So we need a second on that.
I'll second. This is Tim Moore.
Tim. All right. Thank you, Tim. All right. Any further discussion? Okay. I'm going to run through my list again and look for a yes or no. So Peter Coffin.
Yes.
Tim Moore.
Yes.
Lucy St. John.
I'm going to say yes, and I just want to make a caveat with that. In the sense that I'm supporting the fact that the board has, the TAC has voted to move forward with the process. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm supporting the process. Yes.
All right, thank you, Lucy. Mike Whitten.
Same, yes.
All right, Richard.
Speaking yes.
Ken Latchaw.
Yes.
And my people shifted around. Danya.
Yes.
Dave Sharples.
Yes.
Tavis.
Yes.
And Tim White.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So we have a process. I will be taking this to the policy committee at the August meeting, which I want to say is the 10th or 12th or somewhere in that range. I will hopefully streamline this a little bit so that it doesn't take an hour and a half to get through. But I'll be working on that between now and then. And happy to chat further with folks about this offline after the meeting, if anybody has questions or comments that they want to add. And I definitely appreciate everybody's time that they've invested in this, both filling out the survey, providing thoughts and during the meeting and otherwise. So it's all good. With that,
is it all right if we move on to
absolutely.
the Derry, Salem, Manchester Transit Coordination Plan. Mr. Bogle.
All right, let me share screen here and see if I can do this without showing you the next slide piece like last time. Okay. Screen one.
Are you not able to share your screen?
Just see what we get.
Nope, there we are.
So which screen are you seeing? The one with the next slide or just the one slide?
Yeah, we're seeing the presenter view.
Oops.
The big and the small, Scott. There's the big.
Here we go. Try this one more time. How about now?
We're seeing
the DuckDuckGo. Big screen, small screen.
if you shift your display settings at the top of your presentation. Yeah, we're seeing your other screen now, I think.
It's a pretty picture.
It's like a screensaver.
Yes.
God, at one point we were seeing the big screen and then the little screen, which showed the coordinating.
Yeah, how about now? Are you getting the, okay, now I think you have the.
There we go.
All right.
All
Okay.
All right, David.
So technical errors aside, so we are just launching into an update of the Coordinated Public Transit Human Service Transportation Plan for not just the greater Derry-Salem region, which we have worked on in past years, but also the greater Manchester region. And this is a cooperative effort with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission. And the reason for this is that the two regional coordinating councils for community transportation, that for the greater Derry-Salem region and that for the greater Manchester region, merged last fall. So these coordinated public transit human service transportation plans are a mandate under the FAST Act, and I believe they came in under Safety Lou, the prior federal transportation authorization. But metropolitan planning organizations need to develop these plans as a prerequisite for agencies in the region being able to access certain Federal Transit Administration funding streams. In particular, the remaining funding stream that's subject to this is Federal Transit Administration Section 5310 funding, which supports transportation services for older adults and individuals with disabilities. And this is one of the major sources of funding for senior transportation and transportation services for folks with disabilities in the state. So these need to be updated every 5 years. Both the Derry-Salem plan and the Greater Manchester plan were last updated in 2016. So when I'm talking about the regional coordinating councils, some of you have seen this slide before. In 2006, the state established a system of these regional coordinating councils that would bring together transportation providers, municipal officials, agencies such as medical centers that might purchase transportation to coordinate on how best to expand access and do so as efficiently as possible. So for Rockingham Planning Commission region, we've participated in 2 of these regional coordinating councils traditionally. One of those is the Lavender area on the southeast of the state that shows up as Region 10 in this map. And that group is also known as the Alliance for Community Transportation, includes the eastern part of our region as well as the Stratford Regional Planning Commission area. And then until last year, we worked jointly with Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission on Region 9, the Greater Derry-Salem area. Last fall, Region 9 merged with Region 8, the Greater Manchester area. While I think in other parts of the country, these coordinated plans are often done based on MPO boundaries. Here we have done them based on the Regional Coordinating Council boundaries, which took into account a range of factors. But so we actually have two different coordination plans that we work on. The one for Region 10, the Greater Seacoast area, will be up for renewal next year. And we'll work on that jointly with Coast and Stratford Regional Planning Commission. So the basic federal requirements for these plans are assessing transportation needs for folks with disabilities, for older adults, for lower income population, essentially populations that are likely to have unmet transportation needs. We need to develop an inventory of current services and identify gaps in services, develop strategies for filling those gaps, and then coordination actions to try and reduce duplication of services, improve cost effectiveness of services, and thereby expand access. So the overarching goal, as I just said, is to expand access, but to do that through improving efficiency in how funding flows and how agencies collaborate. And so this graphic gives you a sense of sort of how funding flows in a confusing manner in New Hampshire and in many other states. So if you think of funding agencies across the top there as, say, the Department of Transportation, the Department of Health and Human Services Medicaid program, Department of Health and Human Services Elderly and Adult Services funding, then municipal funding. And as an example, say local agency or organization on the left here is Easter Seals. They get some funding through the Department of Transportation, some for Medicaid, some for older adults, some from municipalities. And you have multiple agencies that are all receiving funding streams from these different agencies, each of which has restrictions on who is eligible, what population's eligible, what trip types are eligible, has different reporting schemes, different ways of counting trips. And so it creates a challenge for each of these agencies and also a potential for duplication of services, or at least duplication of effort. The concept, when folks in New Hampshire started talking about coordination a decade and a half ago, was to move towards kind of a centralized concept like this. And this has been used in some other areas of the country, where you have regional transportation coordinators, where multiple funding agencies all channel their funding for a given region through one entity. That entity then provides direct operations, subcontracts out with other carriers, perhaps provides mileage reimbursement and schedules trips for volunteer driver programs. Maybe there's a taxi voucher program as well. This model has not been able to be implemented in most regions of New Hampshire, I think for a range of reasons. Fragmented local funding is part of that, much of the funding that supports small local and regional transportation services is derived from municipalities rather than from the state. And so there are specific relationships that small nonprofit transportation providers have developed in different communities, and municipal funding maybe supports not only transportation services, but other agency services as well. Another challenge has been inconsistent geographies, that there are providers that cross RCC boundaries. And then to some extent also a reluctance to lose independence and to change how they operate on the part of different service providers. So there have been a number of different approaches to coordination that have been implemented in those 9 or 10 different regional coordinating council regions around the state. And coordination really can range from some fairly simple strategies like providing information and referrals, sharing policies and practices, sharing vehicles or sharing software, up to fairly complex systems like the one in that last diagram, or in consolidating functions, ending up with, say, fewer and fewer, possibly eventually a single transportation provider in a given region. In the Derry-Salem region, we have certainly not consolidated to a single transportation provider, but the trend over time has been consolidation. CART and the Manchester Transit Authority merged in the past year. I'll talk about a couple of other consolidations that have happened over time as well. And that has been the direction that things have moved in this region. Some other landscape changes in the region since 2016 that we'll need to deal with in the plan update. I noted the merger of CART, in part because of the merger of CART and MTA, and because of overlapping service areas of a number of other providers. There were quite a few entities that were participating in both the Region 9 and Region 10 RCCs, i.e. the Greater Manchester and the Derry-Salem RCCs. So last year, there was the decision to just merge those, have fewer meetings and have more people engaged in a single conversation. At the time of that merger, the two regions did set up a contract with Easter Seals, New Hampshire to provide mobility management services. And having regional mobility managers is something that is a feature of the state transit coordination plan, and that the Department of Transportation has been strongly encouraging regions to pursue. And in saying regional mobility manager, much of the work that Easter Seals has been doing has been outreach to providers of transportation service that may not already be participating in the regional coordinating councils. Trying to get a sense for what they see as their needs, and encouraging them to participate in the coordination discussion. Outreach to purchasers of transportation, say medical facilities or municipalities in some cases. Outreach to employers that may have an interest in trying to ensure that they have means of attracting employees. Another factor to consider in this plan update is likely access to some additional funding in the coming years. The draft of the new state 10-year plan, which I think has passed the legislature now and is awaiting signature by the governor, calls for flexing 25% of CMAQ funding over to address transit needs. And this was a result of a lot of senior services organizations and transit organizations and others commenting on the need for expanded transit access in the state over the last couple of rounds of Gasset hearings. The New Hampshire Transit Association was asked by the department to come up with a strategy for how that CMAQ funding could best be used to fill gaps that were identified through some of those public comments. Some of that is going to go to, or is proposed to go to urban transit providers, some to rural transit providers, but some to the RCCs to develop new services to meet gaps, to fill gaps that have been identified through these regional coordination plans. I noted consolidation of service providers. One other significant consolidation that seems to be happening currently is Lamprey Healthcare is looking to get out of their senior transportation program, or looking to step back from that, and so has been in conversation with Rockingham Nutrition Meals on Wheels to take that over, which will provide opportunities for better coordination than has been present in the region with those two separate providers. And then last, but certainly not least, we need to look at, what are both the short-term and long-term implications of COVID-19 with regard to transportation services. I think most of you are aware that this past spring, many, if not most, of the transportation services shut down or went to a very limited service for a period of a couple of months. Most of those services are back up and running now, but there are questions as to how will ridership recover, what will happen with funding, both municipal funding, state funding, funding derived from advertising on vehicles. That's a major source of income for most of the urban transit providers. And also for volunteer driver programs, which are a really important piece of the puzzle for providing transportation services for older adults and for folks with disabilities around the state. What are the implications if much of your driver corps is themselves potentially vulnerable older adults, and will those folks be willing to continue volunteering at the rates that they have been? And what are the implications of that for service capacity? So elements of the plan update. For the past plan has included 3 separate surveys, one of transportation providers that we use to develop the service profile, one of municipal welfare or human service directors, and one of other nonprofit organizations in the region that work with populations likely to have unmet transportation needs. The demographic analysis piece includes updating information from the Census American Community Survey, as well as looking at data from the Department of Health and Human Services Medicaid program and the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, and other data from the Office of Strategic Initiatives. So based on those data and the service profile that we develop and the analysis of the input from the welfare officers and other nonprofit service providers, we update our gap analysis, and then go through and refine the strategies from the prior 2 plans. And so we'll need to take the Region 8 plan and the Region 9 plan and consolidate those, revisit the prioritization of strategies. The RCCs essentially focus or function as the advisory committee for these plans. Ultimately, though, the federal requirement is that these be adopted by the MPOs. So once the RCC is content and feels that the plan reflects the needs in the region, we'll go out for a 30-day public comment period and then bring that back to the MPO for adoption. Just a snapshot of membership of the regional coordinating councils. The organizations in black font here are the organizations that participated in the former Greater Dairy Salem or Region 9 coordinating council. Quite a few of those same organizations, with the exception of Salem Caregivers, Dairy, and Hampstead, also participated in the Region 8 coordinating council. So those in blue font are the organizations that are that had been unique to the Region 8 coordinating council. So this is essentially the full membership list for the combined regional coordinating council at this point. And here's a rough timeline for this. We'll be getting going with surveys and demographic data late summer into early fall. Based on the findings from that, preparing service profiles in the fall, reviewing service gaps into the fall and winter, consolidating the prior recommendations and revisiting and refining the strategies, looking for RCC approval, late winter, early spring, going out for public comment, likely in March, and then be able to bring this to the MPOs for adoption at an April meeting. Part of this also will be updating regional transportation service directories. There had been standalone directories for the 2 different regions, and the idea will be to consolidate those. So that's the snapshot there. Any questions?
Scott, within the 3 surveys, I would imagine a lot of the nonprofits will cover refugee and immigrant communities. Has that been your experience in the past? I know that's another demographic set that's likely to use transit.
You know, we heard about that to some degree from local welfare officers in terms of which agencies responded. We got some for Region 9. We get some input on that from agencies that were serving Salem, because there's a significant Hispanic population, immigrant population in Salem. I expect that that's going to be a much more significant issue now with the regions being merged and covering Greater Manchester. An organization that we did not previously interview for this was the adult education program for Salem, the Greater Salem area, which we found is probably one of the better points of entry to get information on the Hispanic population in Salem. And we didn't include them on the interview or on the survey list in the last round. And I think that's something we should do in this round. And so, yeah, let's have a conversation at the next RCC meeting about what are the agencies we can turn to who can best give us information there. I think Lutheran Social Services, or is it now Centria Care Alliance, I think does a lot of work with the refugee and immigrant population. I think we can get other good contacts through the Endowment for Health for that. What are your experiences in Manchester and in agencies to work with to get that information?
It's been one of the hardest groups for us to penetrate. I think there's more unmet need there than in any other kind of demographic slice around here. It's just between the language, the culture, a lot of concern in that community with working with government officials, even though we're bus people, shouldn't be scary. We've had the most success of all places through the Manchester Community Health Center with Chris McCracken. The Green Dash was a project we put out with the focus being connecting the Mill Yard and employees there with downtown Manchester. And that has really totally changed and now is mostly about connecting low income and a lot of the refugee and immigrant populations with the health center, which just happened to be 1 street away from where the route was designed through happenstance. But talking to her and figuring out how many people she was working with that were having trouble getting to, just basic appointments, so that they were ending up in the ER because they didn't have a ride to get to the regular doctor's appointment. And connecting Market Basket onto the southern end of that route through conversations with Chris, that's probably 60% of the ridership on that service now. And it wasn't anything we even knew was an unmet need until those conversations came up. So.
Right. Yeah, so that has not been something that's come to the top in the prior surveys, but I think that may have been, as much as anything, a function of who was being surveyed. So we want to make sure that we're talking to the right people for that in this round. Other questions? Let me stop sharing screen. All right.
All right.
Well, thank you. We'll be back with data in the fall.
Thanks, Scott. So we are essentially at 11 o'clock. It's actually after 11 now. I know I did not get the opportunity to go through the project updates memo that we usually put together, so I don't necessarily have anything to add on that at this point. Given that we've also exhausted our time for the day, we need to let people go do other things other than stare at their computer screen. So maybe we'll skip that item for this month. And then I don't know if anybody has any other open comments or discussion that needs to happen today. Otherwise, we'll maybe let everybody go. Nobody seems to be jumping up and down to add more to the discussion. So maybe we should just call it. Let's call it a day then. You're muted, Richard. I don't know if you're trying to say something.
He's listening for a motion to adjourn, but I don't
Move
think
to adjourn.
Okay. We'd have to vote on it, so I think just declare the meeting adjourned is.
All right. As the chair, Richard, do you want to declare the meeting adjourned?
Yes, sir. That's what I'm going to do.
All right.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.